All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you're excited. We have some really fantastic presentations and a final session lined up for you all today. I'd like to invite our next speakers to turn their cameras on if you would like to, not a requirement. Um, I am very excited for this presentation. We have a really great lineup of folks from NOAA Fisheries, Southeast Regional Office. So we have Orian and Alison from the Protected Resources Division and Helena and Dinorah from the Habitat Conservation Division. And they're going to help us demystify the Endangered Species Act and also essential fish habitat in a presentation titled Helping You Help Us. So I'm really looking forward to this informative session. And with that, I think, Helena, are you the first to present?
I'm going to be the first presenting today, Katharine. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Orian. Go ahead.
All right, and thank you for that enthusiasm. That is what I'm talking about. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Orian Tzadik. As Katharine mentioned, I work in the Protected Resources Division at the Southeast Regional Office, but I am located here in Puerto Rico. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the Endangered Species Act a little bit, and then I'm going to pass along to Alison and Helena, and then finally, we're going to finish it up with some MSA talk with Dinorah. Next slide, please. Okay, so you are all probably very familiar with the different species that are currently listed under the Endangered Species Act. One thing that I like to discuss with people and talk about is that the Endangered Species Act, the species listed under the Endangered Species Act are very different than those that are listed under IACUN, the International, Union for Conservation of Nature. So IACUN has a lot of different categories for how a species can be listed and what level. They have vulnerable, they have endangered, critically endangered, all these different things. The endangered species list of the United States has endangered species, threatened species, and then species that are not listed at all. So the species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act that have a range in the Caribbean are those that you see on the screen. Of the inverts, these are the classic 7 Caribbean corals plus queen conch. The sea turtles are the 4 listed there. And again, you'll notice these are the ones we actually get in the Caribbean. And then of the fish and mammals, we have the ones listed here, the Nassau grouper, a few sharks, and a few whales. Importantly, the marine mammals are also protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So part of the Endangered Species Act actually talks about a species not needing listing if there are other regulatory mechanisms in place. And so that may be why some of the marine mammals that you might think of are not on this list. Next slide. All right, so you may be wondering, well, why are those the species? Why are those species the ones that are listed under the Endangered Species Act? So we undergo a process in which I will talk about in a couple slides here, but basic bottom line is that a species must be listed as threatened or endangered if any of these 5 factors that you see on the screen are considered to be present. So the first would be a habitat modification or destruction and a real threat to the habitat or range of the species. Second would be the overutilization of the species for whatever purpose. The third would be disease or predation. And again, this is, causing a population decline, problems that would cause the population to decline. The fourth is the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. I touched on that with the marine mammals. And then fifth would be other natural or human-made factors that would affect the continued existence of the species. And so the Endangered Species Act requires that the determination for listing be based solely on scientific and commercial information. And this is really important to understand, that economic impacts cannot be considered in making species listing determinations. I think that's pretty clear, but just to say it again, because we get this a lot, we cannot consider trade or sale or the effects that it'll have on a local economy as whether to list a species or not. There are considerations we can take after the fact, but for the listing process itself, those are the requirements. Next slide. All right, and I used the term endangered and threatened, and this is basically the difference between the two has a lot to do with the timing. So an endangered species is a species that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range currently. So it is presently at risk of extinction. And these species that are categorized and listed as endangered are automatically afforded several protections under the Endangered Species Act, specifically those to do with take. And so that would include harm, harassing, collecting, killing, anything like that. Under Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act, all of that stuff is prohibited for endangered species. In contrast, threatened species are defined as those basically that are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future if no action is taken. So they are not currently at risk of extinction, but they are likely to become so in the foreseeable future. And these species do not automatically receive any protections against take immediately unless additional action is taken. So, and one thing to also note is that there is a misconception that a threatened species, once listed, will then therefore become an endangered species. That cannot occur according to the Act unless a separate listing petition and process is undergone. So let's talk about that process. Next slide. All right, I did clean this up, but it didn't make it into the final, so follow the arrows with me, please. We'll start with the blue boxes, and in the top left, you'll see that NOAA Fisheries will receive a petition to list a species under the Act. This will often come from local NGOs, universities, anybody like that who decides that they want to see us put a species under the listed under the Endangered Species Act. After 90 days, we are required to publish a 90-day finding, which could either be negative or positive. And you'll see I have 3 stars there because what happens is that once the 90-day finding is published, that's another opportunity for public engagement and for public comment. So that'll be published in the Federal Register. And if it's a negative 90-day finding, that's the end of the process. The species remains unlisted. If it is a positive 90-day finding, it'll trigger something called a status review. And the status review is that NOAA Fisheries is given 1 year to basically find everything we can about the species and the current status of that species as it exists throughout its range. So at that time, we'll publish another 12-month finding, and along with a proposed rule if it's warranted. If it's not warranted, again, it gets kicked out of the system and it's just listed as not listed. But then if it's warranted, we would put forth a proposed rule and we would ask again for public comment. And then there is a possibility based on those public comments, we would withdraw the rule. If not, we have to address all of the comments that were given to us, and we would then publish a final rule and list the species as either threatened or endangered based on the status review, based on our findings from the status review. Once the species is listed, there are, like I said, if it's endangered, the Section 9 prohibitions go into place, but if it's listed as threatened, then those do not go into place. But there are certain things that happen with all listed species. Specifically, Section 7 consultation. So Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act talks about how permitting from federal agencies, and so these species are now under consideration for all federally permitted processes. So any sort of construction project, any sort of action that needs a federal permit needs to consult with these species that are listed under the Act now. In addition, we will initiate a couple different processes. One is recovery planning, in which we will try to get the species off the list, right? That's the idea. And the other is to designate the critical habitat for the species, which is not just as simple as it sounds. The critical habitat is a defined designation, and it has to do with the biological and physical factors that are necessary for the existence of the species. Next slide. All right, and then just to kind of go into those a little bit further, the critical habitat you can see on the far right. I presented on this a couple of years ago when we put out the critical habitat for Nassau grouper. As you can see, that pretty picture comes from, I believe, Buck Island in St. Thomas, weirdly, not St. Croix. But this is this is what's called Critical Habitat Unit 3. And so you can see the shaded area on the east end there of St. Croix. We heard a nice presentation about that area earlier today. And that is considered critical habitat for Nassau grouper. But as I spoke, it has to have, the critical habitat also has to have the physical characteristics as described in the critical habitat designation. So if we're going to put forth these physical and biological factors, they have to actually be present within that shaded area to be considered critical habitat. And that it comes into play during the Section 7 consultations. Speaking of Section 7, we have these Section 7 considerations. So in the bottom left, you will see how we have gone about guiding federal agencies with regards to queen conch. And so since the listing, we have had a lot of, we've had to include them in Section 7 consultations. And so we have to account for them. And this is a diagram for our guidance on how to survey for queen conch, in this case around docks. And then once you establish whether they're there or not, our guidelines go in further of what to do about that. And then ideally, we would then want to kick into the process of recovery planning, and a recovery plan would include a recovery status review, then the plan itself, and then an implementation strategy. As everybody on this meeting today has pointed out, one of the things that's going to be critical for the success of a recovery plan and the implementation is going to be partnerships and collaboration. I think everybody on this call would agree that the conservation and recovery of a species in the U.S. Caribbean alone, for example, will not bring back a species from a ESA listing designation. So it's important that we work collaboratively nationally, but also abroad. And I think that theme is really getting hammered home here. And I think that's a good way for me to turn it over to, I believe, Alison on the next slide.
Thanks, Ori. I'm Alison Moulding. I sit in St. Petersburg, Florida. I'm in the NOAA Fisheries Southeast Regional Office. I work on protected resources issues, but due to some recent reorganization, I sit in the habitat conservation branch along with my other coral colleagues. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Now that you've heard about some information about how species are listed under the Endangered Species Act, I'm going to talk to you about how NOAA cooperates with states and territories to conserve listed species. And in the Endangered Species Act, when we use the word conserve or conservation, we're really talking about recovery. So under Section 6 of the Endangered Species Act, NOAA can form partnerships with states and territories that have a program for conservation of threatened and endangered species. And these conservation programs must be what we call adequate and active. That's terminology from the Endangered Species Act. And it just basically means that the state or territory has a conservation program that's consistent with the purposes and policies of the Endangered Species Act. So Section 6 allows NOAA to enter into cooperative agreements with states and territories to assist with implementation of their conservation programs. And importantly, it also provides a mechanism to provide federal funds to states and territories for these activities that have a conservation benefit. So to receive funds, threatened and endangered species must be identified in the cooperative agreement between NOAA and the state or territory. However, if there are proposed or candidate species, proposed meaning that there's not a final listing, candidate species meaning that it's been petitioned but there hasn't been a determination yet, and also recently delisted species can also receive funding and do not need to be specifically identified in the agreement to receive funds. Next slide, please. Okay, so Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have maintained cooperative agreements with NOAA since 2003. However, it's been several years since those agreements were last updated. So Puerto Rico last amended their agreement in 2020, and the U.S. Virgin Islands amended their agreement in 2018. So remember I said that threatened and endangered species must be identified in cooperative agreements for the territories to receive federal funds for conservation. So several species have been listed during that, since that last amendment. And so there are several listed species that are currently not included in the agreements and cannot receive federal funds. So these include queen conch in both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and oceanic white-tipped sharks, scalloped hammerhead sharks, and giant manta rays in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That can be corrected. We just need to reach out to those resource management agencies to add them to their cooperative agreements, and we'll try to. When I was putting together this presentation, I realized that, and I reached out to our Section 6 coordinator to just inform him. So he's aware, and we'll be on it soon. Next slide, please. Okay, so NOAA's ESA Section 6 Recovery Grant Program is what we use to provide funds to states and territories for conservation of threatened and endangered species, and as well as proposed candidate and recently delisted species. Funds can be used for a number of activities with a conservation benefit. These can include things such as habitat protection and restoration, research and monitoring, education and outreach, development of management plans, and reducing threats. And if you're interested in applying for funds, a good place to look is the NOAA Species Recovery Plans. To get a good idea of what's been identified as important for recovery when determining what types of activities will be competitive for funding for a particular species. Next slide, please. Both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have received funds for conservation of threatened and endangered species over the last several years. Puerto Rico has successfully applied for funds to support conservation of sea turtles, Nassau grouper, and pillar coral. And U.S. Virgin Islands has received funds for coral conservation, including monitoring, responding to disease, and rescue and restoration planning. Next slide. So we're actually currently in the 2026 grant cycle for recovery funds. It's open through June 20th. Funds can be used to support projects that are between 1 and 3 years that have to do with conservation of ESA listed species. Only states and territories can apply for the funds, but they are able to subcontract to other organizations such as academic institutions and conservation organizations. And in this current cycle, project selection will occur in the summer, and notifications will hopefully be sent by early fall. And then proposals must be submitted through grants.gov. Your point of contact for this, if you have further questions, is Heather Austin. I've put her information up on the screen. Next slide, please. I think this is my last slide. I've just listed the recovery coordinators for the various ESA listed species in the Caribbean. And they're really great points of contact. If you're interested in applying for funds, you can reach out to them with project ideas. And they can also help refine project ideas and review proposals before you submit them. That's all for me. I'm going to pass it over to Helena to talk about Section 7.
Thank you, Alison. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helena Antoun. I work with the Habitat Conservation Division, and I'm situated here in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And I am currently the NOAA Fisheries Puerto Rico Fishery Liaison, but I also do a lot of Section 7 consultation work. And so now that you've had very good background in ESA and Section 6, I will go into what a Section 7 consultation is. If you have had projects that have been federally funded or permitted, you are probably familiar with this. But as part of the ESA Endangered Species Act, any project that is where a federal agency is either federally funded, authorized, or carried out by a federal agency, they need to assure that that activity that is being funded, authorized, and carried out is not going to jeopardize the continued existence of an ESA listed species or designated critical habitat. And for that, agencies are required to do what is called a Section 7 consultation. Now, in the event that there is a project that is privately funded and is not using federal funds, we have another process which is called a Section 10 incidental take permit, and I will get into that a little later. Next slide, please. So when you do a Section 7 consultation, you are trying to determine, whoops, I think you guys went, there we go, yeah. So when you're doing a Section 7 consultation, you want to know whether the federal action will affect or will not affect ESA listed species or ESA designated critical habitat. So we have two kinds of categories for these consultations. We have what is called an informal consultation, and then we have a formal consultation. Now, an informal consultation would be if a project may affect, but is not likely to adversely affect. In other words, the effects of the action could be beneficial or insignificant, meaning that is so small, like the measurement is so minuscule, it's considered insignificant, or extremely unlikely to occur. If the action could be considered to meet any one of those criteria, then it's going to be considered as an informal consultation, and we'll go through an informal Section 7 consultation process. Now, if an action may affect and is what we say likely to adversely affect an ESA listed species or critical habitat, then what we're saying here is that the activities will affect it and the effect will be adverse. It's not insignificant, it's actually significant. But now the question is it going to jeopardize the continued existence of the species or have a destructive or adversely destroy or modify the critical habitat? That would be the next step, and we would evaluate that. If it's determined that there will be an adverse effect, but the species is not likely to be jeopardized, the continued existence is not likely to be jeopardized, or there is no destruction or adverse modification, then we will proceed to do what we call terms and conditions for the project. And this is just to help minimize and monitor the effects of the action. On the other hand, if it is determined that the effects of the action could potentially jeopardize the continued existence of a species and or destroy or modify its critical habitat, then in that case, the project cannot go forward unless we provide what we call reasonable and prudent alternatives that would avoid jeopardy and destruction or adverse modification. Now, if the project is not likely, not that it's not likely. If the project is going to have no effect whatsoever, because there's also that option, it may be something that may have absolutely no effect to an ESA listed species or critical habitat, then we have what is called a no effect determination. And in the case of a no effect determination, you're off the hook. You don't have to do a Section 7 consultation. Next slide, please. So, Section 10. Now, this is something that many especially people in the private sector may not be familiar with. But as Ori mentioned, if there is a species that is an ESA listed species, there is a take prohibition. And take has a pretty broad definition in the ESA. It's not just possession. It is possession, harassment, capture. The list goes on. It's a pretty long list. If you are doing a project and this project could result in a potential take, which would be considered incidental because it's not that you're intending to collect or harm or harass an ESA listed species, but they might actually end up in the middle of your project area and you may incidentally take it or cause take, we have what is called a Section 10 permit for the non-federal actions. Now, this, and again, of course, this is for lawful activities that have already been permitted and authorized. So in the case of a Section 10 permit, threatened species with 4D rules, for example, Kemp's Ridley, green loggerhead sea turtles, and then we also have elkhorn and staghorn corals. They can be covered under the Section 10 permit. Endangered species such as leatherback and hawksbill and pillar coral. And then the application, what happens here is that the application, when an applicant requests a Section 10 permit, they go through an application process where their entire project is reviewed by the team in Protected Resources Division. This gives us the opportunity to review the project, determine if there's any mitigation measures or best management practices that can be implemented to help reduce that take, and then hopefully be able to, be able to provide any recommendations so as to minimize any adverse impacts and reduce any potential take. The PRD, the project will go through a public comment period, which will be published in the Federal Register, and it will receive a final determination from the Protected Resources Division once the review process is complete. A conservation plan or habitat conservation plan is also required for this kind of permit. Next slide, please. So if you're working in the Caribbean, these are, and you've already seen them in the previous slides, but here is a list of all the species and designated critical habitats that we have in the Caribbean. So if there's any project that could potentially affect anything here that's basically on the screen, then if it's federally funded, authorized, or permitted, you would likely have to go through a Section 7 consultation process. Next slide, please. When you do a Section 7 consultation, you are going to be asked to determine what your action area is. So I've included this slide here to help explain what action area is, because an action area is not just the project footprint where you're doing your action or your activity. It's an action area is literally the extent of the area that the effects of the project will extend out to. So if you are doing anything, for example, if there's a construction project and there's a pile driving activity and they're doing pile driving, that noise that is created, that will expand way outside of that project footprint, and that extent of that area of that noise impact, that is included as part of the action area. If there's vessel traffic, if there's transport of vessels from one site to another, that entire vessel route is considered part of the action area. Turbidity is also considered part of the action area. So the action area is not just the footprint, it is the entire scope of the effects of the action, as far out as it can go. Next slide. So in our Section 7 consultation page, we have this really cool tool that you can use. It's called the Section 7 Mapper. And I'll be providing links to all of this later on. But if you go into the Mapper, you can define your action area. You can plot your action area, and then that mapper will tell you exactly what you have in terms of ESA species and designated critical habitat. So that can help inform you as to what sort of species and critical habitat you need to take into consideration for whatever action that it is that you're going to be doing. So if it's a coral restoration project, for example, and if you're going to be collecting corals and there's coral critical habitat, but there's also sea turtle critical habitat, there's going to be a lot of activity in the area. You're going to be putting out in situ nurseries. You know that this is areas where there's sea turtles. So all of that you can take into consideration. You could take that into account when you're doing your Section 7 consultation. Next slide, please. So how do you submit a Section 7 consultation? You send it to that email that's on the screen, National Marine Fisheries, SIR ESA consultation. So what you would want to do is you would send your request to this email, and you would send your proposed project a description of the work that you're going to do, and depending if it's an informal consultation, if it's usually the Federal Action Agency. If it's determined that it's an informal consultation, they will do what we call an expedited consultation, and they will write up a letter, and the letter will explain everything that will be done, the entire project, the project description, a benthic habitat description, and everything, and then they'll go into the analysis of the effects analysis of the project. If it's a formal, then they just need to submit to us the project description, and then a Section 7 biologist will then proceed to develop what we call a biological opinion. When sending information, it's very important. This is something that a lot of it has been happening a lot frequently. People send very large files. If a file is larger than 25 megabytes, it's not going to get through. And one thing that we have been noticing is that you do not get an error message. So if your file size is larger than 25, it's not going to get through, and you're not going to know that it didn't get to us, and we're not even going to know that you even tried to send it. So it's really important to try to make sure that either shrink the file size or use one of those other alternatives to send us your all your files and data. So below is the web page to our Section 7 consultation process. There you will find all the information of everything I just talked about and more. You will find access to the Section 7 mapper. You will find access to templates to help you write up your consultation letters when you're going to send them to us. You're also going to find all the information in terms of guidelines and recommendations and best management practices that's recommended that you follow or include in your project and your project descriptions. And and that's it for me. I will pass it on now to Dinorah.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. My name is Dinorah Chacin, and I am the Core Program USVI Fisheries Liaison, but I sit in the Habitat Conservation Division from NOAA Fisheries or National Marine Fisheries Service. As part of the Habitat Conservation Division, we are responsible for implementing the essential fish habitat provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And these provisions mandate that the Caribbean Fishery Management Council designates essential fish habitats for federally managed species. These habitat designations are intended for the conservation of the habitat, which federally managed species use at different life stages. You see here in the screen a screenshot of usually related to permitting and the different authorizations. I'm really focusing on the Magnuson-Stevens Act essential fish habitat consultations. And that's the rest of the presentation is going to be about. To federal agencies, typically the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, whenever it's going through the permitting process, needs to consult with National Marine Fisheries Service. As Helena mentioned, in our case, will be with the Habitat Conservation Division for potential adverse effects of their actions on essential fish habitat. And I'll go into what essential fish habitat is in a minute. We also consult with any pretty much federal agency. In fact, we often consult with NOAA too. For example, when the Coral Reef Conservation Program needs to complete environmental compliance on the programmatic regulatory documents. This is the way they analyze the effects of activities that the Coral Program typically funds. Timelines can be a little bit different between Section 7 from Protected Resources Division and essential fish habitats. But we often work with protected resources since there is overlap with resources that are both considered, listed under the Endangered Species Act, but are also considered essential fish habitat. And common examples of these include those 7 listed species of corals that you saw in a couple of slides before. Next slide, please. So what constitutes an essential fish habitat, or EFH? EFH is defined as those waters and substrates necessary for fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. Essential fish habitat includes all types of habitats, pretty much coral reefs here in the Caribbean, seagrasses, hard bottom, mangroves, essentially habitats where fish spawn, breed, feed, or grow to maturity. And these have been described for approximately 1,000 species up to date. Please, next slide. Essential fish habitats have been designated for species that are federally managed or have a federal management plan. In the U.S. Caribbean, you're aware that we have the island-based fishery management plans, one for St. Croix, one for St. Thomas, St. John, and one for Puerto Rico. Essential fish habitats are designated through amendments to the federal management plans. We also have habitat areas of particular concern. If you've heard of this term, is a subset of essential fish habitat. And these are rare, sensitive, ecologically important, susceptible to human-induced degradation, or located in stress environments. These EFH don't have extra regulatory protection, but we do consider them more carefully in our consultations. Next slide, please. So when does an action require consultation with us? Well, federal agencies must engage with National Marine Fisheries Service regarding any activities they authorize, fund, or carry out that potentially result in adverse effects to essential fish habitat. An adverse effect is defined as any impact that diminishes the overall quality or extent of these essential fish habitats. Our office then provides conservation recommendations focused on like a sequence of steps, first to prevent, then to reduce, and finally to offset adverse effects to NOAA trust resources. The amount of information that we usually need for these consultations is depending on directly proportional on the level, on the scale of the project's potential impact to EFH. So what does an essential fish habitat consultation process looks like? Well, it starts with first a federal action is proposed that may adversely affect essential fish habitat. Typically, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers issues a public notice and provides 30 days for the EFH consultation. NOAA Fisheries, which is where I come in, we review the public notice and all the provided project plans. It can include an environmental assessment report, an essential fish habitat assessment, which is composed of a description of the proposed action, an analysis of the potential adverse effects of the action on the essential fish habitat and the managed species. This analysis of adverse effects should focus on the impacts of for the habitat for all the stages of the species with that have designated EFH. The federal agency, as part of this assessment, there needs to be a conclusion that the federal agency needs to do regarding the effects of the action on the EFH. Will it adversely affect the EFH or will it not? And typically, an essential fish habitat assessment includes a proposed mitigation if it's applicable. After a review, so that's like within 30 days, after review, we provide conservation recommendations to the Federal Action Agency. And then the Federal Action Agency has 30 days to provide a written response back to us, in which either the action agency adopts the conservation recommendations and provides a 10-day letter for which NOAA Fisheries, then we have 10 days to respond back. or the action agency does not adopt and send substantial response as a 10-day letter for which NOAA Fisheries has 10 days to respond, or the action agency provides an interim response and proceeds to one of the two options above. In the case that the action agency response is inconsistent with our conservation recommendations, the agency has to explain its reasons for not following the recommendations, including the scientific rationale for any disagreements with NOAA Fisheries over the anticipated effects of the proposed action and the measures needed to offset those effects. And so yeah, essentially, like once all the conservation recommendations are adopted and resolved, the pretty much consultation is closed with us. And I think that's my last slide. If you have any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Dinorah. Thank you so much to all of our presenters, Ori, Alison, Helena, Dinorah. That was really informative. I have so many questions I would like to ask about both of these processes, but unfortunately we don't have enough time as we have to move on to our last session of the day. If any of you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and up here you can see that we have our presenters' contact information if you'd like to follow up with them individually, or if they can follow up with you in the chat today. All right, y'all, we got about 30 minutes left of the first day of our NOAA in the Caribbean annual partners meeting. And with that, I'd like to move on to our last session of the day. So yeah, of course, one of our themes always with these meetings is a big focus on collaboration, right? NOAA in the Caribbean is part of NOAA's regional collaboration network. You know, we really work together to make things happen within our region, despite the fact that NOAA has a really broad mission scope. And so what better way to end out day one than by talking about coral conservation across NOAA and discussing how some of our line offices support coral conservation and also coral restoration. So Brian, Aurora, Aranzazu, and Kemit, if you'd like to turn your cameras on. Well, I have Brian up first, actually, but before I pass it off to Brian to give his little spiel and then we move into the panel, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists. So Brian is part of NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program's leadership team and leads their coral restoration portfolio. He's also the co-chair of the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force Restoration Working Group. We have Aurora Justiniano-Santos. Aurora is NOAA's management liaison for the Coral Reef Conservation Program and also the Coastal Zone Management Program in Puerto Rico. She's based in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and works closely with local and federal partners to support the protection, restoration, and conservation of coastal and marine ecosystems. We also have Aranzazu Lascurain. Aranzazu is with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. She carries out partnerships and regional coordination and implementation for OCM as the Southeast and Caribbean regional lead. She's based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, housed courtesy of the North Carolina State Climate Office. And finally, we've heard a lot from Kemit today. Yay, Kemit's on our panel for today. Kemit is a federal program officer with the Community-Based Restoration Program with the NOAA Fisheries Restoration Center. In that role, he currently manages a portfolio of 27 restoration awards across the United States, including the Pacific and Caribbean islands. He is also the RC's point of contact for the Caribbean Support Contract and a member of the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force Restoration Working Group. And of course, he's a member of our NOAA in the Caribbean executive team and is originally from St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. Welcome, panelists. We really appreciate it. We asked all of our panelists to please put together a very short introduction about how their program or line office supports coral conservation and restoration. So you're going to hear from each of them, and then we're going to move into a curated question and answer session. So first up, we have Brian. Brian, take it away.
Thanks, Katharine. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I appreciate it. So I'll go really quickly over my 3 slides here. So as you mentioned, I'm with NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. And we sit across 4 line offices within NOAA. So there's the National Ocean Service, there's Fisheries, There's sort of our research line office, which is OAR, if you're familiar with that. And then there's the satellite office, NESDIS, which actually is the line office I sit in. We also have partnerships with the NOAA Fishery Management Councils, the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, and all 7 of our coral jurisdictions. One thing else I want to highlight is the new National Coral Reef Resilience Strategy was just released. It was mandated that we develop this as a part of the reauthorized Coral Reef Conservation Act. This is a national coral reef strategy. It's not a NOAA strategy. And we have those 6 focus areas there. Previously, we sort of just focused on the top 4 as a part of the Coral Reef Conservation Program's work. But disturbance response became a bigger thing, especially once stony coral tissue loss disease came out, and management capacity is being recognized in the strategy as well as something that's required in all of our jurisdictions. And then we always have these cross-cutting activities of coral reef monitoring, social science mapping, and outreach. Next slide. They also mentioned that I head up the restoration portfolio. So when it comes to tracking all the strategic objectives and progress towards those, that's sort of what I'm doing here in my role with the coral program. It's one of the roles I do. And this is just an example of both the funding mechanisms and how we fund coral restoration. We have our internal funding that goes to all of our NOAA PIs, many who are on the call. And we're in the middle of our FY 27 through 29 planning right now. We have coral reef management fellowships, and so that puts fellows in all of our jurisdictions, and often some of them are doing coral restoration related work. We have a number of grant programs, and we have many grant recipients also on this call. And then when it comes to activities, it's everything from active restoration to restoration planning. We do a lot of work with Acropa palmata monitoring, research into a lot of resilience and health on the genetic side, looking at toxicity in corals, just the whole gamut of coral conservation and research. Next slide. And then the last thing I just want to sort of talk about is the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. So the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force is all of the federal agencies that kind of deal with coral reefs. I think it's like 14 federal agencies. It's the representatives from the All Islands Committee, which is the 7 jurisdictions in the 3 freely associated states. I chair the Restoration Working Group, and we just had our U.S. Coral Reef Task Force meeting in Puerto Rico, where we ran a restoration knowledge exchange. There's some stats there about how it went, and there's lots of you in that photo there, and it was super successful. We brought in lots of practitioners from both the Pacific and the Caribbean to share ideas. We got to see and hear from practitioners in Puerto Rico and from the USVI talking about all the great work that they're doing. And it was a really great chance to collaborate across all of our jurisdictions and kind of learn from what each other are doing to make sure we're not making the same mistakes and we're building on from what others are doing. And I will pass it on from there.
Thanks so much, Brian. Next up, we have Aurora. I also wanted to mention that Aurora was on our planning committee for this meeting as well. So thank you so much, Aurora. I'll let you take it away.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Katharine. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, like Katharine said, I'm the management liaison for Puerto Rico. So I work very closely with the Coral Reef Conservation Program here in Puerto Rico's Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, and also the Coastal Zone Management Program. But today I'm going to focus a little bit and just talking very briefly about the partnership with the Coral Reef Conservation Program of the DNER. And this partnership has been ongoing for more than 25 years, almost 26 years. And it has done a lot of great work throughout this year. But today I'm going to focus on some of the priorities that the Department of Natural Environment works with in very close collaboration with NOAA. And first of all, I'm going to talk about the long-term monitoring program. This has been a program that has also been going for the last more than 20 years. And during this monitoring, the Puerto Rico DNER evaluates the status of coral reefs throughout the island. They have several monitoring stations all along Puerto Rico where they take measurements of benthic composition, also fish and invertebrates. They do some analysis on coral health. And recently they have been also working on water quality monitoring. A second priority for the program, as well as for NOAA, is the land-based sources of pollution. So through this collaboration, the DNER has been working very closely with sedimentation, but also watershed management in different areas of the island. Like, for example, there has been a lot of work done in Guánica and also in Culebra throughout the years. We have also been working with coral disease and disturbance response. So here, the program addresses urgent biological threats specifically, such as disease, but also invasive species. So as you all know, there was a lot of stony coral tissue loss disease here in Puerto Rico that was addressed through the DNER in partnership with NOAA. And very recently, we're having some invasive species, invasive soft coral, that is affecting coral reefs throughout the south coast of Puerto Rico. And we are very well involved in trying to deal with this emerging and urgent threat. Next, we're working with climate change and extreme weather. This is done by recovery of post-hurricane restoration, and also by evaluating and monitoring thermal stress, such as bleaching and other thermal activities and thermal threats that can be happening in the island. Another important focus for both NOAA and the DNER is overfishing and sustainable fisheries management. So the DNER has been supporting many programs and many programs relating with herbivore health, and also has been conducting several trainings to the DNER rangers to strengthen the response operations for overfishing and other threats to the coral reefs. And finally, something that the department has been doing for a long while now is working on vessel groundings and recreational impacts. So the department works very closely with a lot of volunteers that do some restoration once a grounding occurs to try to save some of the corals that are affected by these groundings, and just overseeing the removal of some of the abandoned vessels that are also throughout the island. And I have to say that all of this is also done with a very strong outreach and educational component. The DNER celebrates every year Coral Week, which brings together a lot of the different partners throughout the island that are working with coral-related themes and coral restoration. And they would bring them together so they can share their experience, share their works. But also something very nice is that they do a lot of in-the-ground and site visits throughout the island. There are a lot of activities going on where the general public just can go and visit some of the sites that are doing restoration and that are doing coral work throughout the island. So this is a very, like I said, a very brief discussion of the partnership that has been going for more than 26 years between NOAA and DNER. But if you guys have any questions, you can just let me know. And I think I'm going to pass it to, I'm not sure, Katharine, is it Aranzazu or
Yes.
Kemit?
Aranzazu next. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Aurora. Aranzazu, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. Well, to build on the overview that Brian and Aurora have presented this afternoon, I wanted to give you a little overview on the intersections from our office, the Office for Coastal Management, and the way in which it also intersects with coral restoration work. So just to give a little review here, the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972 and 4 other statutes under our office, which includes the Digital Coast, the Regional Ocean Partnerships, the National Coastal Resilience Fund, and the Coral Reef Conservation Program, work towards corals. And I'd like to give you a few examples here. So the mission is to increase resilience of nation's coastal zone by helping communities and businesses keep coastal residents safe, the economy sound, and natural resources functioning, and works with partners from all sectors to address coastal issues and to find solutions. Here, I wanted to give you an example of how, in particular, the U.S. Virgin Islands Coastal Management Program operationalizes their coastal management program towards benefiting corals as one of the ecosystems. And since 1978, they've been responsible for ensuring orderly and balanced use of U.S. Virgin Island coastal zone while protecting important ecological resources, achieved through permitting and directly funding partners to implement resilience-focused efforts, and many of which are directly focused on corals or indirectly benefit corals. Next slide, please, Katharine. Katharine, can you hear me?
Aranzazu, it should be on the next slide. There might be a little delay.
Thank you for announcing the delay. I appreciate that. And here are a couple of examples that I wanted to go over that are the ways in which programs under Office for Coastal Management help towards coral restoration. And again, you know, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we wanted to show you the many different ways that across NOAA these efforts help to complement coral restoration. So through the National Coastal Resilience Fund, which NOAA contributes to, the idea there is to focus on risk reduction through habitat restoration and benefiting communities. So for example, just wanted to give you an idea that looking through our projects since 2019 through 2024, for example, there are about 7 projects between Puerto Rico and USVI that specifically in the title, you know, benefit coral restoration or coral habitat. And that amounts to something like $5.6 million. Now, again, we've got many more projects in that pool of funding that also benefit coral, whether it's ridge to reef work, whether it's mitigation of land-based sources of pollution, for example. So another important fund of funding that goes towards benefiting corals. And then also through the Coastal Zone Management Act, through what we call base funding and additional resource management grants through Section 309, Section 306A, 306 of the Coastal Zone Management Act, also work towards benefiting it because we support programs in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands. And then third are the National Estuarine Research Reserves, which fall under our office. We provide 2-year annual awards. For example, Hopos Bay Reserve in Puerto Rico. And then the very good news is the U.S. Virgin Islands is moving towards designation of a reserve. So that's very good news. And then again, that work will contribute to benefits towards coral. And then lastly, I wanted to mention the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge, which was a one-time investment. U.S. Virgin Islands is a recipient of one of those grants amounting to $69 million given towards the end of 2024. And this has a very large component towards land acquisition, which again aids towards that prevention of land-based sources of pollution. And then it also supports many partners in U.S. Virgin Islands towards restoration, habitat improvement, mangrove replanting and support for Coral World, for example, to do outplantings and genetic rescue as well. So I want to leave it there, and thank you very much for your time. I'll hand it back to Katharine.
Thanks so much, Aranzazu. And last but not least, we have Kemit. Go ahead, Kemit.
Thanks, Katharine. And I'll be pretty brief because I feel like I've been talking almost all day. But yeah, I sit in the community-based restoration program, which is located in the Restoration Center and which is in the Office of Habitat Conservation, based here in Silver Spring. Again, habitat conservation, we're are pretty much focused on protecting and restoring habitat. We do that to sustain fisheries, to recover protected species, and to maintain resilient coastal systems, both ecosystem as well as the people, human communities. Our staff provides technical guidance for in a number of different ways to support a number of different habitats, to support the planning of work, the design of work, and then eventually the implementation of work as well. Some of our awards focus on the removal of barriers to fish migration. Some of them focus on reconnecting coastal wetlands, and that can be done through planting of native and disappearing plants, as well as hydrodynamic work to reconnect water where it used to be and no longer is. And then, of course, we help to rebuild coral and oyster reefs. Next slide, please, Katharine. We restore habitat throughout the country in a number of different programs, and we have appropriations as available, but we've had a few under the community-based restoration program, a few large-scale restoration activities. Some of you might remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. That's what actually got me into the restoration work when I was a recipient of some of that funding to do some great work. And we have now been focused on the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, or the IIJA funding, which has something like 200 projects and close to $1 billion worth of funding that have gone to support coastal restoration work across the U.S., coastal states, and the islands. In addition to those awards, we also do quite a bit of work in the damage assessment, remediation, and restoration program. And that pretty much is our focus on responding to ship groundings. Oftentimes there's legal precedents in some of those cases that offer additional funding to continue to do even more restoration work. And outside of ship groundings, we also have consideration for hazardous waste and oil spills. And I'll pause there. That's kind of what my, I guess, a pretty high level overview of the work that we do in habitat conservation. Just a small part, just what I'm focused on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, Katharine?
Thanks, Kemit. All right, thank you so much, panelists. If you all want to come back on camera, we do have a few minutes. I think I'll pull one question from our questions list to ask you all. So yeah, really appreciate you all again providing a quick overview of your program. We heard from the Coral Reef Conservation Program. That's a program that's built to work across NOAA, right? Heard from investments from the Office for Coastal Management, and then also investments here from NOAA Fisheries Restoration Center. So I'm going to pull this question from our list. What is an emerging issue in the coral conservation or coral restoration world that can be addressed working across NOAA? I'll open it up. I don't know if anybody wants to take that first. Maybe Brian, I could pass that to you to begin.
Sure. I know one emerging issue that I've been working on is probably the sexiest issue, and it's permitting and policy. It has to do with CITES and Nagoya. As we're needing to transfer material between countries and across the Caribbean, this has been rising up as one of the bigger hurdles for our practitioners to get over. So the Coral Restoration Consortium, which is an international organization, they have a working group, a policy working group that I sit on, and I'm working with a few folks, and we're reaching out to some individuals to try to identify what are the biggest hurdles and how can we address those. And when it comes to CITES, what sort of waivers can we get in or have added there? Like, what are the waivers that exist that we can use to help with this? And slowly working on larger change is going to take a lot of time. And I think NOAA sits at that level that this is where we should be, or at least where I should be engaging in, especially with like the Restoration Working Group for the Coral Reef Task Force. Slowly building up these documents, pulling in people from other federal agencies, bringing something to the next COP in 3 years to be like, hey, can we add this one small little caveat to this to make lives a lot easier for restoration practitioners, at least in the Caribbean, if not in the Pacific as well?
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. Thankfully, we have a great team of note takers working now. So note takers, please note that, because maybe this is something we need to bring up in next year's partners meeting or in a future community group meeting. Thanks, Brian. Aurora, I'll pass it off to you. Is there anything going on in Puerto Rico that you think could require better cross-line office coordination around emerging issues in this field?
Well, yes, and I see Kemit that is also nodding, so he can jump in at any moment. But we're working with the invasive soft coral. That's an emerging issue, and it's like really affecting the south coast of Puerto Rico, and it's probably going to be moving soon to USVI. Hopefully not, but it could happen. Not that I wish it doesn't happen, but it could happen. So this is very important for us to work with the different offices, and we kind of were able to do that during the task force meeting. We had a separate meeting with our colleagues at NIMS and Restoration Center, and we're trying to figure out what is the best way to conduct environmental compliance and see what is the best way to work to try to remove and stop that invasive species from just colonizing all of our corals. And Kemit, just go ahead and give us your point of view.
Yeah, Aurora, that was going to be my, that's the first thing that popped into my mind. If there's any issue that we're dealing with that requires a collaboration. We've already been on how many calls now, Aurora? I feel like we did weekly calls leading up to the task force, and then we've been on a number of calls since then, including multiple calls in one day with different groups of people. And so it's definitely front of mind, and it will require the partnerships. It will require the research, learning from our colleagues in Hawaii and the Pacific that have addressed it and have found ways to mitigate for it. It will require the tools that we are building a toolbox for Puerto Rico right now to have all these different mechanisms and ways that which that can be used to address it. The environmental compliance piece that we're working again in partnership with a number of different offices to get the green light to be able to act. And then the implementation at the end of the day, the monitoring, all of the things that we talked about that we do for bleaching, we're going to do similar things. The frameworks exist, and so we'll be able to do similar things to monitor the locations where Xeni is a problem, and then assess how we treat it and what the reefs look like hopefully on the other side of it all.
Thanks, Aurora. Thanks, Kemit. Aranzazu, an emerging issue that's popping up.
Well, just disclaimer, I'm not a coral expert. I'm more of a big zoomed out picture kind of person. And I would say, I've had this fascination with sargassum. I'm very interested to see whether, sargassum is impacting corals in any way. I think, so I've been thinking about that. I've also, and I think what's really, astonishing and wonderful about sort of the NOAA enterprise is that we have that whole pipeline, right, from basic science to the applied science to the restoration and implementation phases, and NOAA represents all of that. And I'm also being more of a climate person, I think about sort of these climate refugia opportunities that might exist in the Caribbean, some of this kind of cutting research that might help inform we don't even know what's possible potentially with coral, and I think that really brings in all parts of NOAA and our partners, especially, right? People on the ground that are witnessing this, who spend their daily lives in and out of the water, who can feed this information to us, and where we could potentially co-create, right, these applied solutions.
Thanks so much, Aranzazu. Thank you all. What I'm hearing is things that we can follow up on, better coordinate on at NOAA, this permitting and policy piece that Brian talked about, the international component, soft corals, of course, Aurora, Kemit. I would love to see us also do a session that's cross-island and learning more from our colleagues out in the Pacific. And Aranzazu, yes, we will absolutely be having some sargassum sessions moving forward. I'm interested to see how that affects coral reef ecosystems as well. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude our Crossline Office panel today. So thank you so much, Brian, Kemit, Aurora, Aranzazu. We really appreciate you all taking the time to share a little bit about your programs and talk a little bit about some of those emerging issues. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Kemit, who's just going to give some brief closing remarks, and then over to Jillian.
Hey everyone again. It's been a long day, but a great day. So I just wanted to jump on quickly to say thank you to all of the presenters that responded and agreed to join us and share the wealth of information that we've received today. So I won't call everyone by name, but from the top of the day to where we are right now, I think we've had a very good and educational, entertaining, and amazing day. So thank you all for presenting, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the Caribbean today.
Thanks, Kemit. And again, yeah, thanks all for all the presentations and talks and panels today. Super interesting, inspiring things. I just wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow is an in-person day. There also is there's still the virtual option if you're not close to an in-person hub, so you can still attend and participate in these tabletop exercises tomorrow. We do still have space in San Juan as well as Cabo Rojo, right? Yes. So, and if you're attending virtually, you can just join using the same link you used this morning. So we still have some in-person spots available in those two locations. If you are attending the San Juan location at DNER, they do have a no shorts policy. So if you're attending that one, just be sure to wear pants. And as Yaditza mentioned earlier, ICER does not have AC. So if you're attending that one, dress appropriately. Sammy said Silver Spring, they still have room in their hub as well. And we also have one or two more spots left here in St. Thomas too. So if anybody else is interested in that one, just reach out. And if you have any questions before tomorrow, please feel free to reach out, and we look forward to seeing you all then.